Hello, and you're welcome to InvestBlade TV with Kenny. Recall that we've been on a 31 days journey talking about investing knowledge, and different things you need to know about investing for yourself and acquiring generational wealth. I've said that this channel will skew more towards investing in the stock market, and today I have a very interesting topic, and that's, do you want to invest in the Nigerian stock market or the US stock market or global stock markets? Which one is it going to be? First of all, I want to talk about Nigerian stock market. Of course, our company owns a number of stocks in the Nigerian stock market, whether it's Nestle, whether it's Union Homes, whether it's GTB, whether it's Dangote, and you name it. And these stocks have done well over time. And of course, it's a good place to start. And that's it for Nigerian stock market. Why? Because you are able to gauge the performance of these companies. For example, you know how much you spend on Glow, you know how much you spend on MTN. So you can say, well, if MTN ever comes to the stock market, I know they're doing well and I want to invest in them. Sometimes you see some enterprises and you say, well, if this enterprise could ever come on the stock market, I want to buy some shares. And of course, recently, some Nigerian banks recently floated some shares, maybe because of the CBN directive that came and they needed to increase their market capitalization. So these are things, because Nigerian stock market has a bit of a familiarity and you are able to see one or two things. And that's very good. The only challenge for me has been the subject of how much of a backstory do we have on some of these stocks in Nigeria. For example, do you know whether the stocks are being shorted? Do you know whether there's different things that are motivating the stock prices? Is there a scheme going on that you are aware of or you are not aware of? These are things you need to look at. And also, do we have enough materials to do the research on them? Very, very important. For example, if the stock market in Nigeria moves X amount, what's behind it? Is it a general trend? These are things we need to look at. What amount of resources do we have to be able to dig into what's making these shares move this way? Thank God for the earning per share, price earnings ratio, and some of these other fundamental scores. And we're going to look at that in a few days' time. So that's that. However, I've heard somebody say recently that, the Nigerian stock market grew by 40%, while the S&P 500 in the US only grew by 15%. So Nigerian stock market is doing better. Well, yes and no. Yes, in nominal terms. Nominal terms is, what does the sheet of paper tell you? Of course, you always want to take plus 40 over plus 15. That looks like a bit of a progress. But we now have to talk about what did the plus 40 of the Nigerian stock market, what did it translate into? So you remember, we've been using the analogy of 100 US dollars for some time now. So if you invested 100 US dollars in the Nigerian stock market and then you invested 100 US dollars in the US stock market, what is the difference? Right, the S&P 500 that you mentioned grew by 15%, while the Nigerian stock market grew by 40%. Well, that's good. But remember that you've converted the money into Naira, and this 40% that you said your investment grew is in Naira. However, under the umbrella effect of the falling Naira, you begin to see that the 40% growth in the Nigerian stock market does not really translate to much. So that for me is a big thing you need to look at. That is to say, do you want to just stay with this Naira growth that just has nominal value, but not the real value of the money growth that you had? Do you understand that? So this is something you want to look at very carefully to be sure that, hey, the amount of money you say you make, you are really making it in essence. All right. Now, how do you now choose? Do you choose to invest in Naira, or you choose to invest in USD or US stock market, which is either NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange? And that brings me to some very interesting Nigerian stocks. These are Nigerian stocks that are floated in the Nigerian Stock Exchange, and then they're also floated in overseas stock exchange. A case in point is GT Bank. GT Bank has some Naira shares and then also has the UK shares. So this way, you are able to say, you know what, instead of buying GTB Naira, I'm going to buy GTB UK shares. So that does something for you. I know because of the higher level of regulations that some of these overseas stock exchanges have. Of course, there's significant regulation in Nigerian Stock Exchange, but there seems to be a more robust mechanism to regulate these companies overseas. So the GT Bank UK shares seems to have a bit of more supervision, more compliance requirement on them. And guess what? Should GT Bank ever crash, the person that invested in GT Bank UK maybe has a bit of a more buffer to be able to confirm that, hey, you are not going to lose your money, if I can use that term, if something ever goes wrong. So that's a way to play it. I want to invest in a Nigerian company that I'm proud of. I want to be a proud Nigerian versus do I invest overseas? And these things are possible these days. And we're going to go give or take before episode 15 or between episodes 15 and episode 20. I'm going to talk about what are the platforms you can invest with in Nigeria and how do you play. So I've said Nigerian stock market grew 40%, US stock market grew 15%. Well, while that's a greater nominal value growth, it doesn't really translate to money in your pocket because of the falling rate of the naira. So you could play stocks, that is, you could invest in stocks that are floated in the Nigerian stock market and then floated overseas as well. That helps you to have best of both worlds, and that tells me something about investing in Nigeria, in the Nigerian Stock Exchange. So I'll leave it at that. Let's talk about the US stock market. The US stock market is not the only stock market that exists. They may be the most popular or the most noised abroad, especially because some of the biggest tech companies in the world are floated on there. That's New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, right? And there's these different types of stock market. There's Japan, there's the one in Europe, there's the UK one. So every country has their own stock market, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. My research is showing that the growth that the US stock market has experienced over the decades is not likely to continue in the years to come. While there will still be some growth, it may not be as high as it has been previously. So if you're somebody that invests in the US stock market, whether New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, you need to understand that, hey, there's a world out there beyond the US stock market. And that's very, very important, because this begins to tell you where do you want to put your money for the greatest alpha, that the greatest effect for growth of your income, the money you have put in. So this is very, very important. So why we say, okay, invest in the US stock market, it has a few advantages. Number one is the quality of research that you could do over a stock. For example, there will be one episode where I'll talk about what are the different numbers that you cannot see when you talk about the share price of a company. So for example, let's assume that Tesla is going for maybe $248 per share. While that is the share price, there are about 25 to 40 other numbers that reflect on that stock, that share price, that many people don't pay attention to. So there'll be time for us to look at that. Is that okay? So I'm talking about the fact that you might invest in the US stock market, but there's a world out there that is not US stock market. And then two things come to play. Do you diversify? Do you even have a platform where you can invest into other stocks that are not in the US stock market? Well, not many people have access to it. In some of my investigations, I see that some of the platforms where you can invest in stocks that are not in the US, they usually are tied to banks, right? Banks in some of the countries of the world. So I know Interactive Brokers does a good job at that. And then I also know DeGiro, that's an app based in Europe. They also do a good job of exposing you to stocks, not just in the US stock market. But I want us to begin to talk about platforms that expose us to the Japanese stock market, for instance, Asian stock market, for instance. India is doing some very interesting things with Reliance Jio over there, Mukesh Ambani, and things like that. So these are things we need to begin to explore. And that's talking about, do I invest in Nigerian Stock Exchange or do I invest in the US stock market? Well, I'm now concluding this by telling you that there's still a world outside the US stock market. And that's very, very important. Now, talking about the US stock market, because it's one of the most, I'll call it with the most cash or market capitalization, for example. So many companies looking to, get a flush of cash into their companies come to list in the US. These companies may not even be based in the US, but because they are listed in the US, Americans and people that have access to the NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange are able to, put some money and then they get money for their businesses that way. So these are things you want to look at. For example, in saying I want to diversify out of US, you could actually invest in a company that is not based in US but is listed on the US stock market. So let's assume there's an Indian company, right, that is not based in the US but as listed in the US stock market. So that's another way to play it. And don't forget, everything we say on this channel, none of it is investment advice, just for educational purposes. You need to have your own investment advisor to make that decision. And that's a very important disclaimer that lets you know that you are responsible for the decisions that you make. If you haven't checked, episode 3 talked about the different types of investment vehicles. While we talk a lot about stock market, you don't have to invest in the stock market. You can invest in the other investment vehicles that we talked about in episode 3. And I hope I've been able to supply one or two pieces of information that guides you at this time. And don't forget, I want to hear what you want to talk about. Somebody has given me feedback that they want to hear about ETFs. We're going to do that in a few days' time. Is that okay? And don't forget, this is still Invest Blake TV with Kenny, and we're on a 31 days journey to talk about investment education and then go on to greater things from there. I hope you got something and see you in the next video. Thank you.